They were allowed to walk into the town under supervision, expecting tension, expecting eyes to follow them, expecting people to step away the moment they appeared. But no one stopped, no one reacted, and no one treated them like prisoners. And for a moment, they didn't know how to keep walking, because nothing around them behaved the way it should have. The group moved forward along the road leading into the town, their steps controlled at first as they followed the path set in front of them, while the first buildings came into view, aligned in a way that felt structured but unfamiliar. One prisoner adjusted his pace slightly as he crossed the edge of the road into the town, stepping onto a different surface and lowering his gaze briefly before lifting it again to observe what was ahead. Another man turned his head to the side as they passed the first building, tracking the doorway for a moment before facing forward again and continuing without slowing. A third prisoner shifted closer to the edge of the group, adjusting his position to get a clearer view of the street, then stepped back into line to maintain spacing. A man near the front slowed half a step, forcing the prisoner behind him to adjust quickly, stepping to the side and then forward again to keep the movement steady. A vehicle passed slowly along the road ahead, and several prisoners turned their heads at once, following it briefly before returning their attention forward as it moved out of sight. One prisoner stepped slightly out of line, then corrected himself immediately, aligning his position with the others as they continued walking deeper into the town. Another man adjusted his posture, standing more upright than before as he passed a row of buildings, scanning windows and doorways without stopping. A small group of civilians crossed the street ahead, continuing their movement without hesitation, and several prisoners slowed briefly as they watched them pass before moving forward again. One prisoner near the center turned his head slightly longer than the others, tracking the movement of the civilians until they disappeared from view, then returned his gaze forward. The group continued along the street, but the rhythm had changed, no longer uniform, as each man reacted differently to what he was seeing around him. And as they moved further into the town, the first real shift began, because the environment around them did not respond to their presence the way they had expected. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the group continued along the street, the distance between them and the civilians ahead began to close, and several prisoners adjusted their pace slightly, some slowing while others maintained the same speed. One prisoner turned his head toward a man standing near a storefront, holding his gaze for a brief second before facing forward again and continuing to walk. Another man shifted closer to the edge of the group, stepping slightly outward to gain a clearer line of sight, then returning to position as they moved forward. A civilian carrying a small bag walked past them without stopping, maintaining his direction and pace, while two prisoners turned their heads to follow him for a moment before refocusing ahead. One prisoner near the front slowed half a step as a woman crossed the street ahead, forcing the man behind him to adjust his stride to avoid contact. Then both resumed their pace. Another man looked toward a window display as they passed, turning his head briefly, then straightening again without breaking formation. A prisoner at the center shifted his path slightly to avoid stepping too close to a civilian standing near the sidewalk, then corrected his position and continued forward. A man near the back of the group turned his head further than the others, tracking two people walking in the opposite direction, then faced forward again as they passed. One prisoner adjusted his posture, standing more upright as he moved past a group of civilians who continued their conversation without reacting to his presence. Another man slowed briefly near a building entrance, then stepped forward again to close the gap that had formed in front of him. The group continued through the street, but the pattern had already changed, as the lack of reaction from the civilians forced each prisoner to adjust his own movement in response. And as they moved deeper into the town, the second shift took place, because the contact they expected never happened, and the absence of it began to affect how they moved forward. As the group moved further into the town, the storefronts began to line both sides of the street, and several prisoners shifted their attention outward, turning their heads to follow the rows of windows as they passed. One prisoner slowed slightly as he approached a large window, lowering his gaze to examine the items displayed inside, then lifting it again as he continued forward without stopping. Another man adjusted his path closer to the edge of the sidewalk, stepping nearer to the storefront to get a clearer view, then stepping back into position to maintain alignment with the group. A third prisoner turned his head longer than the others, tracking the contents of a display from one end to the other before facing forward again as he moved past it. One man near the front leaned slightly as he walked, angling his body just enough to keep the window in view for an extra second, then straightened again and continued. Another prisoner stepped forward more quickly to close a small gap, then immediately slowed again as a new storefront came into view, adjusting his pace to match what he was seeing. A man at the center shifted his weight from one foot to the other while walking, maintaining his forward motion while keeping his gaze fixed on a display inside the window. One prisoner briefly lifted his hand as if to point, then lowered it again without completing the gesture, continuing forward while keeping his focus on the glass. Another man turned his head toward a second window, comparing what he saw there with the previous one, then straightened and moved on without stopping. A prisoner near the back stepped closer to the edge again, then corrected his position, aligning himself with the group while still glancing sideways. The movement of the group became uneven for a moment, with some men slowing and others stepping forward to fill gaps, creating a shifting rhythm as they passed each storefront. And as they continued along the street, the third shift took place because the environment around them demanded attention at every step, forcing them to react constantly to what they were seeing without breaking their movement forward. As the group continued along the street, a small change occurred when a civilian stepped closer to the edge of the sidewalk, reducing the distance between himself and the passing prisoners. One prisoner near the front noticed the movement and adjusted his pace slightly, slowing just enough to track the man as they approached, then continuing forward without stopping. The civilian remained in place, holding a small object in his hand, then shifted his stance to face the street more directly as the group came closer. Another prisoner moved slightly to the side, creating a small gap between himself and the man ahead, allowing himself a clearer line of sight as they passed. As the first prisoner reached the civilian, the man raised his hand briefly in a simple gesture, not stepping forward, not speaking loudly, just acknowledging the moment before lowering it again. The prisoner responded by continuing forward without breaking his pace, but his movement changed slightly, becoming more controlled as he passed directly in front of the man. A second prisoner followed immediately after, turning his head toward the civilian for a brief second, then facing forward again and continuing along the same path. Another man shifted his position outward, stepping closer to the edge of the sidewalk before correcting himself and moving back into line as he passed the same point. The civilian remained still as the group continued past him, not following, not reacting further, simply returning his attention to what he had been holding before. A prisoner near the center slowed slightly as he reached the same spot, then stepped forward again, maintaining the flow while keeping his gaze ahead. Another man at the back turned his head longer than the others, tracking the civilian for an extra moment before facing forward again and closing the distance with the group. And as the interaction ended without interruption, without escalation, and without any visible change in the environment around them, the fourth shift took place because the contact they expected to create tension had passed without producing any reaction at all. As the group continued moving through the town, the earlier reactions began to change, not stopping, but becoming more controlled as each prisoner adjusted the way he observed what was around him. One prisoner near the front no longer turned his head fully toward the buildings, instead shifting his gaze briefly from side to side while maintaining a steady forward pace. Another man kept his eyes ahead for several steps, then made a short glance toward a passing window before returning his focus forward without slowing. A third prisoner adjusted his position within the group, stepping slightly closer to the man in front of him, reducing the gaps that had been forming earlier. One man who had been slowing repeatedly now maintained a consistent rhythm, matching his steps with those ahead without creating new interruptions. Another prisoner passed a group of civilians without turning his head at all, keeping his posture steady as he moved forward. A man near the center shifted his shoulders slightly, aligning his body more directly with the path, then continued without looking outward again. One prisoner briefly lowered his gaze to the ground as he walked, then lifted it again and continued forward with a steadier pace. Another man adjusted his stride to match the group more closely, reducing the uneven movement that had defined the earlier moments. A prisoner at the back closed the distance between himself and the group ahead, stepping forward more decisively before settling into the same rhythm. The line became more uniform again, not because of orders, but because each man had adjusted his movement based on what he had already experienced. And as they continued deeper into the town, the fifth shift took place, because the reactions that had been immediate at the beginning were replaced by controlled movement, shaped by everything they had just seen. As the group reached the end of the street, the direction of movement shifted, and the prisoners began to follow the path leading out of the town, stepping away from the buildings and back toward the open road. One prisoner near the front adjusted his pace as the surface changed under his feet, lowering his gaze briefly to follow the edge of the road before lifting it again and continuing forward. Another man turned his head for a final glance toward the storefronts behind him, then faced forward again without slowing, maintaining his position within the group. A third prisoner stepped slightly to the side to avoid the man ahead of him, then corrected his path and aligned himself back into the same direction as the others. One man at the center shortened his stride for a moment, allowing the group to compress slightly, then extended his next step to restore the spacing as they continued moving. Another prisoner kept his gaze forward without turning again, maintaining a steady rhythm as the town began to fall behind them. A man near the back looked over his shoulder briefly, tracking the street for a final second before turning forward and closing the gap ahead of him. One prisoner adjusted his posture, standing more upright as the open space replaced the structured environment of the town. Another man shifted his position closer to the center of the group, reducing the distance between himself and the others as they moved along the road. The movement became more consistent again, with fewer pauses and fewer adjustments, as the environment returned to something more controlled and familiar. A guard walked parallel to the group for several steps, observing without speaking, then changed direction and moved ahead without altering the pace of the prisoners. And as the town disappeared behind them and the road stretched forward again, the sixth shift took place, because the experience had ended, but the way they moved had already changed, shaped by everything they had just passed through. They expected tension the moment they entered the town, but nothing around them reacted the way it should have. And by the time they left, the silence had changed more than anything else. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.